first little girl was born about 8.5 years ago at McGee Women's Hospital, the first visitor to walk in the room brought my wife a copy of Spock, Baby and Child Care. And through the torturous first few weeks of having your first child, the question most heard around our house was, look it up in Spock. And I guess like many of you, I considered Benjamin Spock a baby doctor, just like the fella 2 blocks up the road and you turn right. The only difference was that he was always more available. He was in the kitchen drawer, and the doctor was playing golf. So Spock was more available. In recent months, however, Spock hasn't been quite as available in person. Spock has been indicted. And Dr. Benjamin Spock could well go to jail for his belief in the peace movement. We have with us on our program this evening via tape, because he's already left Pittsburgh and couldn't be with us live to take your phone calls, for which we are very saddened, Dr. Benjamin Spock, a man who many of us admire, as if we were to draw a list of great Americans, we'd have to put him in it. Welcome to these microphones, Doc.
Thanks for those compliments.
I don't know quite what to ask you because there are so many questions, but I think that the one I'd really like to ask you is, why would a fella your age, with everything in the world going for you, you were here at Pitt in the mid-50s, you were at Western Reserve, you can make 25 or 30 G's a year out of a book, why in the name of God would you get involved in something like this?
I'd give 2 answers to it. One is that back in 1962, I suddenly realized that if nuclear testing is carried on more and more by the United States and by other nations as they get nuclear arms, more and more children around the world are going to be killed by cancer and leukemia. More and more babies are going to be born with mental and physical defects. In other words, we've got to begin demanding universal disarmament and an end to testing. And so I thought that as somebody who has influence with parents, that I ought to stand up and be counted. That's one answer. In other words, I saw a very close connection between disarmament, the end of war, and the continuing health and even existence of our children.
Doctor, I don't want to interrupt you, but what I'd like to know, and I think a lot of folks would, since our time is so short, one of the closest knit groups in the world is the medical fraternity. What has the reaction been from your colleagues to your stand, to your trial, to your conviction? How are you treated by your fellow physicians now? There's a lot of people walk around the street and call you kook. What do these guys do?
Well, I think a majority of them just thought I was a kook, because I think a majority of doctors pay attention to the issues of medicine and don't get out into other issues themselves, and they don't quite understand a doctor who does. On the other hand, I think that they were much more disturbed by my advocacy of Medicare back in the earlier years. This, they thought, as disloyal to my colleagues. So I was disliked by more doctors for that than for my peace stand. When I had to retire at Western Reserve Medical School a year and a half ago, because I'd reached the age of mandatory retirement, I did have the satisfaction of at least half a dozen members of the staff coming up to me and saying, I used to think you were a nut in your attitude toward the war in Vietnam, and now I've come around to your view. I think any time people who say they used to be against you and are now for you, this is any one of these people is worth 10 of the people who are on your side all the way along. You know, there's no gratification like feeling that you won somebody over to your side. I've also gotten in the last year, especially since I was convicted, a large amount of mail from physicians around the country, and I would say that 9 out of 10 of those letters say, I admire your stand, I think it's time doctors paid attention to the issues of the world, and you've been an inspiration to me. And of course these probably don't represent more than a very small percentage of the profession, but they're very gratifying to me.
Dr. Spock, we live in an age of public relations, and I was told very recently that one of the best jobs of public relations ever done on the American people was the war in Vietnam. It has been sold brilliantly. How do you answer somebody who says, prove to me that the war is immoral and illegal and that it's a Vietnamese civil war?
Well, I think that the only thing that you have to be willing to do is go and look at the history of the war. And I don't mean you have to get out a big fat history book. All you have to do is go to a library and say, I want 2 or 3 pamphlets on Vietnam, or one book on the history of the war, or a reporter's comments on his reporting there. And I think that the chances are you'll suddenly realize that what our government has been telling us for the past 4 years, really for the last 10 years, is not substantiated by fact, that the United States was never invited up in there, that it never went in there as a result of a committee commitment, that it went in there as part of a power grab. And in a sense, President Eisenhower in his memoirs admitted as such that we went in there with our puppet to try to take over that part of the world, knowing that 4/5 of the Vietnamese people would have voted for Ho Chi Minh if they could have.
Do you think now, Doctor, right now today, that the American people are already beginning to get the public relations built up so that we can send troops to the Middle East, getting us ready for another involvement? Do you think there's any merit to that thinking?
Well, I hate to think so, but there's no question that our country is very lopsidedly interested in the Middle East, primarily through oil. I think very few Americans know how strong our oil interests are there, and the oil industry has a tremendous influence on the American government. I would feel much more comfortable if somehow or other our country could be cut loose from that interest.
I have seen you with groups of young people speak to them on their level and reach them. And yet many of us cannot reach our own children. The generation gap is more than a slogan. There is a generation gap. There's something wrong. What can we do about these young people? Not about them. What can we do for them? How can we save America, if it's to be saved, for these youngsters?
Well, I think in the first place that they're much more likely to save America if we can keep the world from exploding until they grow up a little and can vote. Because I think that they not only are more realistic in seeing what needs to be done in America, what needs to be done by America in the world, than the older generation. Furthermore, they're more willing to commit some of their own energy to trying to save the world, that they aren't just concerned with earning a living, the biggest, the fattest living that they can get. I think even more they've got the courage, as they've shown on a number of occasions, the march on the Pentagon, the demonstration in Chicago at the time of the Democratic Convention. I think that they're the only hope of America and of the world, so this is good. I don't think there's as much of a generation gap as people say. I think that the many young kids dress enough differently now, talk enough differently, have enough difference in interests, so that older people feel alienated from them. But I haven't found that young people are unfriendly to old people. I think it's the old people who shrink back and feel that there's a great distance. Now, I think that it's very different in regard to your own children. I think your own children always have to be critical of you, make you feel that you're unfair, that you're not understanding them. All kids from the beginning of the human race have acted this way. So I think it's much more difficult to have the feeling of community of interest with your own children than with other children.
If you were to give me, and when I say me, we're hoping now you're talking to thousands of people in my position with 2 young children, small children, any piece of advice as to what I could really do for them, what would you tell me?
Well, I think that this is Polonius kind of advice, but I think that the thing is to assume that they're decent, that they're well-intentioned, and try to reason things. I don't think that one should give in to your children, even in adolescence, on everything that they ask, and I don't think they really want you to. They want to hear honestly what your views are, but they want to hear it in a reasonable way. They want to have you give the reason and act as if you believe that they have the intelligence to hear your discussion and help in making the decision.
We keep hearing about the double standard, Doctor. You know, it's not all right for my little girl to cheat in school, but it's all right for me to fix a traffic ticket, and I use that as an example. Not that she would cheat or I would fix traffic tickets, of course. But what can be done about this double standard? How can we explain it to our children?
Well, I think this is another favor that we can do our children, is to try to be as honest as they're trying to be. And I think that this is one of the big differences between youth and age, that the older you get, in general, the more likely you are to make compromises for expediency, not because you never admit that you're really being a bad person, but you just say the world isn't quite this simple. So I think as we get older, we're more inclined to corrupt ourselves by small degrees, and I think it's good to it's good for us to try to be more honest when we have children of this this adolescent age, if only so that they can respect us more.
What percentage, Time magazine said last week in a wheel drawn for them, that roughly 60% of the kids on the college campuses agree, at least, with those who take part in the demonstrations. 5 or 6% take part, 1% are violent. But 60% agree. What percentage of the 60, if we were now to lop the 60 into 100, what percentage of the 60, Doctor, do you think 10 years from now will own a house with a big mortgage and a couple of cars and be up to their ears in debt and be just like the rest of us?
Well, of course, we have to admit that always the tendency is, even if you've been a radical or a quite liberal person in adolescence or early adulthood, the tendency is to get more conservative. And this has to be when you have a wife and children and a responsible job. But I don't think that means that everybody has to get 100% conservative. The fact is that there are people who've stayed radical all their life, and there are people who've stayed at least liberal all their life. And my own hope is that this new attitude of youth will go deep enough so that when they do have a job and a family, that they're not going to switch sides altogether.
What percentage of today's radicalism and revoltism, if you will, including your own, do you chalk up to the black movement, to the 1954 Supreme Court decision and Mrs. Rose Parks refusing to give her seat up on a bus? What percentage do you chalk up to that, even if there's no black-white involved in it now?
Yeah. I think probably the issue of justice to black people was very important in alerting young people and making them aware of the injustices of the world. And then I think there was this extraordinary circumstance that just at the time the black youths who were working most militantly for justice to black people got impatient with having white people, young white people working with them, and asked them to go and work among the white population and let them work among the black. That this happened just at the time that Lyndon Johnson escalated the war. So that in a sense, the most idealistic young white people had moved from the civil rights movement into anti-war movement just at that time. I think that these are half the explanation of why youth is more militant and more concerned with justice. But I think probably there's another more basic reason. That is that the whole of America was rather idealistic during the war. War at home brings out some of the better sides of human nature, because people feel that they're all devoted to a common cause that's not selfish. Then after the war, it happened after World War II, just the same as World War I. Suddenly the war is over and everybody says, now we don't have to be idealistic anymore. Now we can just be concerned with getting possessions for ourselves. And I think that went on from 1946 to 1960, let's say. Then there's bound to be a reaction, because I don't think human nature is totally materialistic. After you've had a very materialistic swing, then it's time for people to say, and it's always the young people who feel the new trend first, the young people to say, life can't consist entirely of salaries and retirement income and number of cars and television. So I think that this is, I think it was time for the more idealistic side of mankind to reassert itself. And that it was the civil rights movement and then the anti-Vietnam War movement that picked up that change in the tide.
I must say that this was recorded yesterday, Sunday, and if I were to tell you the community in which it was recorded and on the street in my car, it would be almost interesting if we could have gone door to door while this was being recorded and knock on some of these doors and say, hey, Spock's out there. Spock is out in that car. I don't know what the reaction would have been. Mine is that it was a great pleasure meeting and talking with Dr. Benjamin Spock, M.D., who, no matter how long he resists the war, no matter whether he goes to jail or doesn't, I'm sure most of us hope he never will always in my house be in the center drawer in the kitchen for, I guess, my grandchildren as well. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.